Hey, this is Josh with NEPA Cash Offer. Just want to do a quick little story time. A little while back, we had a seller that called in. She owned a few houses with her late husband, whom she was separated from. And unfortunately, in this situation, since they hadn't been divorced, there were some Department of Revenue liens from the state of Pennsylvania, and those liens never go away. So even though her and her late husband had been separated for several years, they hadn't officially been divorced, which meant those Department of Revenue liens stuck with her. She had two properties, and both of them were owned by her and this late husband. And she called in and basically was not living in the properties because they had obviously been separated, and they were in terrible shape. Both of them had probably $50,000 to $70,000 worth of repairs needed there. We ended up agreeing on a purchase price, and essentially, while we were under contract, we found out about these Department of Revenue liens, which she was unaware of, and so was I. So rather than her receiving $50,000 or $45,000 at closing, these Department of Revenue liens actually had to be paid off. And the kicker, these properties were scheduled for auction. The real estate taxes hadn't been paid on these, and so they were actually scheduled for auction. Basically, if she hadn't paid off these Department of Revenue liens and the properties were foreclosed on, those liens still would have stayed attached to her personally, even though the properties had been sold at auction. What we were able to do is we actually, I think, increased our offer several $1,000s to help cover those Department of Revenue liens. Unfortunately, she ended up walking away with zero at closing, but she did not have to pay those $47,000 in Department of Revenue liens, and she didn't have the houses go to foreclosure, which would have affected her credit for several years, and she still would have had those Department of Revenue liens after the closing. Essentially saved her from having to pay $47,000 in Department of Revenue liens later on. And we tried working with the Department of Revenue to help get those lowered, and they just were not having it. Anyways, that's story time for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day.